I want to ask a little bit about the Jeffrey Epstein story because I think that was the definition of the deep state. Someone who clearly was involved with some state or states. I think it's pretty obvious it was a honey trap sort of influence operation. And Trump had talked about releasing those files, like releasing the Kennedy assassination files. And it was sort of proof that he was going to take over the deep state. He made promises. His attorney general, Bondi, made promises. And now they're saying, oh, there's nothing to release. And I think that this is a symbolic thing. People want to know the truth about Epstein, but they also want to know that Trump didn't get sucked into the deep state or wasn't bamboozled by them or rolled by them. And I think, I'm not sure how widespread an issue this is. I don't know if it's going to make anyone not vote for Trump. I think the immigration thing is so huge, and taxes are huge, and jobs are huge, and they're real. And maybe caring about the Epstein file is sort of a hobby or a luxury belief that people just like an intellectual exercise. But what do you make about it? Because Trump seems to be saying there's nothing here.
I don't think there's anything there more than what we know. And I've always felt that way. I thought it was pretty easy to understand why Jeffrey Epstein had killed himself, and I do believe that he killed himself. Remember that Jeffrey Epstein had lived a high life. He was a billionaire. He had then been convicted of statutory rape. He managed to work out a plea deal, and he walked free eventually. It was a very lenient sentence he received, and he moved on with his life for the most part. Then the first Trump administration nominated a man named, I believe, Alex Acosta for labor secretary. And Acosta had been involved in the plea deal. I think he had been the U.S. attorney, the prosecutor involved in agreeing to the plea deal. So the Epstein case hit the spotlight again. And with that case came a bunch of other important political personalities who had been involved, not because they'd been implicated in wrongdoing, but, for example, a good friend of mine, Alan Dershowitz, had been Jeffrey Epstein's defense lawyer at one point. So a lot of high-profile personalities were suddenly involved, people with things at stake, and Acosta, I think, was a big one. And Epstein found himself rearrested after thinking he had put this behind him. Not just rearrested, but rearrested for essentially being a pedophile. And then he was being held in this cell. And when the news came out that he had killed himself, it made complete sense to me, because what I was looking at was a man who had suffered this. I mean, it's hard to describe him as a victim, right? He was a terrible criminal in many ways. But in a sense, he had made a deal with the government that he thought was good. He paid good money for those lawyers to make the deal. And then he found himself in prison facing potential prosecution once again for things that he thought he had put behind him. I think he knew he was never going to get out of jail or prison. I think he believed he was going to be held and be in captivity essentially for political reasons. Everybody on the Democratic side and Republican side had a reason to have him in prison, not because he was going to spill secrets necessarily, but because the fact that he had this sweetheart plea deal for these heinous crimes embarrassed everybody involved. And so I think he saw himself just as a target for the rest of his life, and so he killed himself. That was my feeling at the time.
But what about the statements from Attorney General Bondi that there were an enormous number of files, and the reason they couldn't be released is because of protecting the identity of the victims of his child rape? And what about, so I'm not saying...
No, I think all that is true. I mean, I think to some extent the conservative new media created something more out of this than it was. And there's a danger in that you buy into some of these narratives too. You always have to have a little bit of skepticism. I mean, obviously, I'm open to the idea that there was more there, especially given the high-ranking officials from other countries and so forth who seemed to frequent Epstein's island and so forth. But I also think that you have to look at the simpler explanations. Let me give you another example of that. I'm doing a story right now about how my own governor in California, Gavin Newsom, is spending $100 million on low-income housing in the Pacific Palisades. This is something residents have feared for a long time. Town burned down, and we fear they're going to fill it with housing projects, okay? And that's because California is run by socialist Democrats. So these fears turned out to be well-founded. But then there's an additional step, which is to say, maybe that's the reason it burnt down. Maybe they let it burn down or even set it on fire to allow themselves to build this low-income housing for illegal aliens, for the homeless, and so forth, and to do it on prime real estate near the ocean. Now, that's a level of conspiratorial thinking you have to remain open to, because sometimes things like that do happen, but it's just not the best explanation, and it requires a level of coordination we're just not used to seeing from government officials.
I hear you, and yeah. I believe in Occam's razor, which is the philosophical principle.
Yeah, I didn't want to go there because I don't. I actually don't. I don't believe in Occam's razor. I believe in a healthy skepticism toward everything, but just to go with I mean, my gut feeling on this is that the fire was an accident. My gut feeling on this is that the Epstein death was a suicide, and I stand to be corrected on these counts, but that's just how I feel about it.
I just can't get out of my head that clip of Melinda Gates describing how this was why she divorced one of the world's richest men, her husband of decades. I'm not sure if you saw it. She said he just wouldn't stop going back to meet him. And it was that. And his excuse, Bill Gates, for meeting with Epstein more than a dozen times was, I was trying to fundraise. One of the world's richest men, maybe he would fundraise from Epstein, but after he realized it wasn't, like that just doesn't hold up. You don't meet with a guy a dozen times. And that's not why Melinda Gates divorced. He said he was ghastly and a horrible. Here's a quick clip of that.
It was also widely reported that Bill had a friendship or business or some kind of contact with Jeffrey Epstein, and that you were not, that was very upsetting to you. Did that play a role in the divorce at all in this process?
Yeah, as I said, it's not one thing, it was many things. But I did not like that he'd had meetings with Jeffrey Epstein, no.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you made that clear to him?
I made that clear to him. I also met Jeffrey Epstein exactly one time.
Did you?
Yes, because I wanted to see who this man was. And I regretted it from the second I stepped in the door. He was abhorrent. He was evil personified. I had nightmares about it afterwards. So, my heart breaks for these young women because that's how I felt. And here I'm an older woman. My God, I feel terrible for those young women. It's awful.
You felt that the moment you walked in? I didn't realize that.
He was awful.
Yeah. And you shared that with Bill, and he still continued to spend time with him?
Any of the questions remaining about what Bill's relationship there was, those are for Bill to answer.
Okay.
But I made it very clear how I felt about him.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think the reason why people care is not because they want a different kind of justice for Epstein, who is now dead. It's they want a different kind of justice for Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman and anyone else who they think participated in those pedophile rapes. And I don't know, I don't think I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I understand what you're saying. Look for other explanations. But there is no other good explanation for Bill Gates being divorced by his wife because she says he just won't stop visiting Epstein. It wasn't, to play cards or to fundraise. It was for rape.
I think we know a lot about Epstein's friends already. We know about Bill Clinton. We know about Reid Hoffman, as you mentioned. We know about others. And I don't think they've really been held accountable for what we already know. So the things that people are upset about are already in the public domain. I don't know what extra information people expected to find, maybe some kind of evidence he was working for a spy agency or something like that. I mean, I think everything looks set up to make that possible. Certainly he knew some very high-ranking people. I mean, he knew Ehud Barak, the left-wing former Israeli prime minister, who's now been implicated in these visits to Epstein Island and was fundraising with him. But what's interesting is it doesn't stop left-wing think tanks from featuring Ehud Barak very prominently when he wants to criticize the Israeli government. So,
and Bill Gates has never been more, widespread.
Right. I mean, I think that the job of holding these people accountable really falls to people like you and me. But I just didn't expect more to come out of the Epstein files. And I think that people who hung around with him knew they were playing with fire. That's why his longtime assistant, Maxwell, is serving a lengthy sentence in prison. I think it's unfortunately the double standard that often applies isn't just in our justice system, it's also in our media ecosystem. I mean, to look at a different sort of part of the Clinton world, James Carville is basically outed himself as a raving anti-Semite, but he's on news analysis shows all the time for his opinion about this and that. I mean, prominent people are not held to the same standard, especially if they're on the left. And I think that's also part of the Epstein story, but I didn't know how much more there was really going to be. Likewise, I don't know that it makes sense to prosecute James Comey and Brennan and some of these other figures who were part of the Russia collusion investigation. I mean, we know they're liars. We know that they fomented the whole thing. Is it worth wasting time prosecuting them and looking for some kind of smoking gun, or should we just, think about other things and move on to other things? I'm not saying forgive and forget. I'm just saying I wonder if the American right is investing in past narratives that helped solidify or articulate an idea about what was failing in our government, but might not help Donald Trump achieve his agenda. So that's all. I'm just not heavily invested in the Epstein story because I don't think there's much more to mine there, even if it was entertaining for a while, in a grisly sort of horror show kind of way. To me, what's really interesting is what's happening with immigration policy. We may find out more about what Biden was up to. I do think there are some smoking guns about how Democrats made the decision to throw our borders open and why they did so. I think we are going to find that there are some political motives that are probably in writing somewhere, and they've called the rest of us racists for assuming that Democrats want these people to be voters someday. But I do assume that evidence will emerge. So I think there are things, there are battles worth fighting, and we're so busy in the Trump era, we don't have the resources to fight things I think that are already settled.
All right. Well, listen, I won't go at you another time on that because I feel differently. I feel that there's a lot of there's a deficit of information and a deficit of justice, and I think that the deep state has won here, and I think to see Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and others go mum and become that which they criticized 6 months ago, I think is telling. Listen, I still love the Trump administration. I think what they're doing on immigration is the most important thing for Western civilization.
Can I defend Patel and Bongino?
Sure.
And again, I could be wrong, and I've made mistakes like this in the past, but I will say that I actually have more respect for them because they got a better look at the evidence than any of us have, and they had to go against what they said before. That doesn't mean they sold out. It means they were honest, I think. That's another explanation. They just saw the evidence or the lack of evidence, and so they revised their earlier statements. Not because they had to do so. I mean, in this sense, the people who elected them expected them to continue where they were. It took some political courage to look at the evidence and say, I was wrong about what I said before. Now, you can look at that as conforming to the swamp, but I think to give them the benefit of the doubt is reasonable here. I think maybe they just stood up and said, okay, we thought there was more here than there was. So.
Well, if Melinda Gates changes her mind and remarries Bill Gates, then I'll accept that thesis. But as long as
she had billions of reasons to divorce Bill Gates, she walked away. She walked away with those reasons.
Yeah. Well, she had. I mean, she really can. It's called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think she was just as in control as he was. I mean, I believe her when she says about her personal life that was the reason she divorced him. I believe her. And
I don't. I actually, that's where I don't believe her. I think that the Epstein scandal became embarrassing to her, but I think that privately, as long as it didn't make the news, I think she was okay with it. That's my personal suspicion about it. I don't think that she could have interpreted Bill Gates disappearing for weekends at a time any other way than that he was having affairs or having some kind of alternate romantic attachments. I mean, I think that these billionaires get away with a lot of that sort of thing, and their wives who are attached to their wealth tolerate it. And I think she was prepared to tolerate it until Bill Gates became associated with Epstein and Epstein came back into the news. I think it was convenient for her to get rid of him. I think there are other cases like that as well, where the wives of wealthy and famous people have tolerated their misbehavior until it became public. And then they, shock and outrage. I didn't know about this. And, I feel betrayed and nonsense. I mean, I'm sure it's true in a couple of cases, but I think for the most part, this behavior was tolerated. And then when it became a problem for Melinda Gates. I mean, again, I don't want to disparage her. This is just my hunch about it. I can't prove it, but it's speculative. I wouldn't take anything these people say at face value. Nothing.
Well, we'll leave it there. Joel, thanks very much. I didn't really mean to get into a debate with you about the Epstein
file.
I just wanted to
this is the healthy discussion. You know, this is we're both talking about our instincts here, and you need kind of both sides of this to get to the truth.